Hi everyone, welcome back to the USCPA classes for financial accounting and reporting. Yes, this is part 2 of ASC 842, that is lease accounting, right? Please go through the part 1 before jumping into it because it is in continuation of the part 1. So in this particular video, I'll be walking you through in detail about what is lease, type of lease, parties in lease, right? Finance lease, operating lease, sales type lease from the lessor standpoint of view and lessee standpoint of view. Everything will be covering over here. So let's dive into it to understand more in detail.
Okay, so let's jump into understanding the lease. What exactly is a lease? So lease is a contract or part of a contract that covers the right to control the use of identified PP&E. PP&E means property, plant and equipment, an additional asset for the period of time in exchange of consideration. That means you are getting the right to use the property, plant or equipment for the period of time in exchange of the consideration which you are paying. Such kind of arrangement are called lease arrangement. And what are the parties involved in a lease arrangement? Lessor, who is providing the asset, and lessee, who is receiving the asset. A lessor convey the right to use asset, either it's real or personal property. What is real property? What is personal property? Any idea? Any idea what is real property or what is personal property? Some of you have done REG classes. Any of you have done REG classes or not yet?
No, sir.
Not yet. Okay, so real assets are like the assets which are being attached to the land, right? So which is land and building, right? Your warehouse, right? Or maybe your tree plantation, right? So those assets are called real assets which are being permanently attached to the land. Personal property.
Machinery.
No, personal properties are machine like your car, your automobile, your machineries, your equipment, or your laptop, all the furniture, electronic items are called personal property. But when machineries or personal property get permanently attached with the structure, then it is real property. For example, if you have like centralized air condition in your building, right, which is permanently fixed into that building, right? So in that case of scenario, that centralized air condition is become a real property. Or for example, if you have uh, like fans, let's assume, so they are being permanently fixed on the ceiling, so then it become a real property. Or if you, let's say, if you have, let's say, some machinery which is being permanently fixed and installed into the, you can say, platform. I think, have we discussed last time about some molds example or not? Have we discussed about some tire manufacturing company, how they make tires with the molds?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We
Yes, sir.
discussed.
Right.
Yes.
I have shown you like the picture also, like how platform need to be built, and then like half of the machinery go inside the platform and half of the molds comes outside, right?
Right.
So in
Right.
that
Right.
case of scenario also, those machinery which is being permanently get fixed into the structure, then it become a real property. So other than that, it's all personal property, whether you are computers, your you can say laptops, or your automobiles, or your equipments in the office, your printer, all those things are personal property. So a lessor conveys a right to use the asset. It may be real or it may be personal. So real means land and building. Just assume for simplicity of example, like personal would be your machinery, equipment, computers, laptop, JCB machine or something like this, right? To the lessee, who agrees to pay the consideration for this right over the lease term, right? So there are two parties. What is lease? First we understood the arrangement between the two parties for providing any asset for the use, right? And the two parties are lessor and lessees. Now let's understand how to determine whether in an arrangement lease exists or not. First, you need to evaluate, is there an identified asset, whether it's real or personal? If answer is no, then the contract does not contain lease. So there should be property, plant, and equipment, right? If the answer is yes, does the customer have right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefit from the use of that asset throughout the period of use? Right? So first thing, you need to identify whether there is an asset or not. If there is no asset, then it is not a lease. If it is an asset, then you need to evaluate whether the person who is receiving the asset is getting the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefit from those assets or not. If the answer is no, then also this is not a lease contract. But if the answer is yes, then you need to evaluate, does the customer or supplier have the right to direct how and for what customer and what purpose the identified asset is used throughout the period. So there are two parties now. Who is having the right to direct the use of asset? If the right to direct the use of asset is with the customer who is receiving, then it is a lease arrangement. But if the right to direct is still remain with the owner, with the supplier, right, then it is not a lease arrangement. Makes sense? Because right has not transferred yet. Yes, no? Any doubt so far? First three box, good?
Yes, sir.
Next question you need to evaluate, does the customer have a right to operate the asset throughout the period of use without the supplier having right to change those operating instructions? If the answer is yes, then it's a lease arrangement. If the answer is no, then evaluate, did the customer design the asset or specific aspect of the asset in a way that predetermine how and for what purpose the asset is being used throughout the period of the lease. Like for example, ambulance, right? I think this example we have discussed in the ASC 606 also, right? For example, if someone has constructed or built an ambulance specific for Apollo hospital, right, in which everything is being according to the specification of the Apollo hospital, in that case of scenario, the answer is yes, it will be considered as a lease because the person who is providing the asset does not have any alternative use. For example, like fire truck established. So if, for example, any company has built a fire truck, it is specific for the use of fire department, right? No other department can use such truck. So in that case of scenario, it will be considered as a lease. Make sense? So if I summarize the entire picture over here, first is there should be an asset, right? Then the person should be having a right to obtain or substantially all the benefit, economic benefit from that asset. Third is the person who is receiving the asset should have a right to direct that asset and right to operate that asset, or the asset is being specifically designed for him. Then that arrangement is being considered as a lease arrangement. If these condition does not match, then that is not a lease arrangement. Any doubt here? Or anything need more clarification? So far, so good?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes. So now jumping on to the classification of lease. Classification of lease from the leasing
Sir?
standpoint of, yes.
एक सेकंड सर, वो मैं पीछे समझने की कोशिश कर रहा था। जो कस्टमर और सप्लायर लिखा है आपने इधर, डज द कस्टमर और द सप्लायर, मतलब लीज के केस में मैं समझ नहीं पा रहा ये कस्टमर और सप्लायर कैसे
Or
आया
you
है
can,
इसमें।
I'll simplify this as leasing.
अच्छा वही है मतलब, ओके
Right? Simple.
ओके, none none.
So if leasing is having right, then it's lease. If still the right remain with the lessor, then it's not a lease.
Okay, done.
Okay, so next topic is classification of lease. So classification of lease from the leasing standpoint of view is different than the lessor standpoint of view, and lessor standpoint of view is different than the leasing standpoint of view. So in the leasing standpoint of view, there are two type of lease: finance lease and operating lease. Whereas from the lessor standpoint of view, first would be sales type lease. If it is not a sales type lease, then it is a direct finance lease. If it is neither a sales type lease nor a direct finance lease, then it's an operating lease. So first criteria in both the case is very much same. So the criteria from the leasing standpoint of view, which you are evaluating to consider the lease arrangement as a finance lease, is the same criteria applies from the lessor standpoint of view to consider that as a sales type lease. So let's understand from the leasing standpoint of view first. So leasing standpoint of view, leasing is who is receiving the asset. First, whenever you receive any asset under the lease arrangement, first we need to evaluate from the leasing standpoint of view whether that arrangement is a finance lease or not. If it is not a finance lease, it automatically fall into operating lease. But whether that lease is a finance lease or not, we need to evaluate through these 5 criteria. So what are those 5 criteria? First one is title, or you can say ownership transfer to the leasee by end of the lease term. So for example, you entered into a lease arrangement for a car lease. So there, like you have taken a car on a lease for a period of 3 years. Same, let's assume the same example. Cadillac car of $50,000, which you have taken on a lease for a period of 3 years at the rate of $2,000 a month. And after the completion of 3 years, the seller has given you the right to purchase that Cadillac car in just $5,000. Whereas at that point of time, the market value generally is in a range of $10,000 to $12,000, depending on the condition of the car. That means you are getting a material right to purchase that car. So there are most likely that you will purchase that car, right? So in that case of scenario, if you consider that example in your mind and then you evaluate this statement, then probably you can correlate the theory with that example. So first one is title or ownership transfer to the leasee by end of the lease term. That means what is the lease term? What is the lease term in our example?
3 years.
3 years. So what does it say? After 3 years, you will be purchasing that asset. And the company is giving you material right, which is ensuring that most likely you will purchase that. Because any which ways you are saving $5,000 to $7,000. Right? You can just purchase, and if you are not liking it, you can sell it in the market. So the most likely chances are you will purchase, right? So hence that arrangement can be considered as a finance lease. Second is lease contain a purchase option that lease is reasonably certain to exercise, which we have discussed in our example. That purchase option $5,000 after 3 years, whereas the market value is $10,000 to $12,000. Third is lease term is for the major part of the remaining economic life of asset. So here, like for example, generally for a car, the life is 10 years, right? Here in our example, we consider it for 3 years. But let's assume someone has taken the car on lease for a period of 8 years. That let's assume same Cadillac car of $50,000 each, you have taken on a lease for $500 for a period of 8 years. That means you are using that car for the most of the economic life of the asset, right? Hence, that lease arrangement is considered as a finance lease arrangement. Sorry, your voice is very less.
Yeah,
Gurmeet.
can you hear me now?
Hmm.
Well, life is 10 years and we are leasing out for 3 years. Then it will not be
Hmm.
considered as a finance lease.
No, we need to consider any one of the five.
Oh, okay.
Any one of
It's
the
not
five.
like all of those
All the
five
five.
you
Yes,
have to
yes,
admit.
yes.
Okay.
Mhm. Right. So if you are getting the ownership transfer, then it is finance lease. If you are getting a material right so that you will purchase that asset, then also it is finance lease. If you are using it for more than the economic life or like more than average economic life, then also it will be a finance lease. Fourth point is the present value of the sum of the lease payment and any lease guaranteed residual value not already in the lease payment equal to or exceed the fair value. For example, like if you remember that same catalytic example, $50,000 is the catalytic price if you buy it today, right? And you have taken it on a lease for a period of 3 years. And how much lease rent you are paying? How much lease rental we are paying?
2000 per month.
Huh?
2000.
$2,000 a month, right? $2,000 a month you are paying for how long? 36 months,
Right.
right?
72,000 in total.
Right. So if you see 36 multiplied by 2,000, that means you are end up paying 72,000. But if you use present value, that means time value of money, let's assume it is coming as 65,000, right? So look at the D point now. Present value of the sum of lease payment, which is 72,000 multiplied by present value factor, let's assume 65,000, and any lease guaranteed residual value not already in the lease payment equal to or exceed the fair value of asset. So this 65,000 which you are paying, the present value of the future payment of 65,000 is greater than the fair market value of the asset today. Hence, that lease is being considered as a finance lease. Make sense?
पर ये 65,000 का कहाँ से आया?
तो एक बार रिपीट करोगे ये वाला
हाँ,
मिस हो
फॉर
गया.
एक एक्सेल शीट का एक्सेल शीट. Can you see the Excel sheet? So let's assume you have taken a market price of Cadillac cars $50,000 and lease and how much is $2,000 period? How much? 36 months. And this and let's say discount rate. Let's assume 10% discount rate. And so how much is the present value? You know how to calculate present value? Rakesh?
Yes.
It's 2,000. Right. These are the 36 month, and here you'll be multiplying the PV factor. And here it will be 1, and then this multiply by and divide by 1, 1. Maybe you can take a present value factor table. Are you in verse 2 with the present value factor table? Like these kind of table, do you remember? Do you remember from your school days, you might have seen such kind of tables? Yes, no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes,
Hmm?
sir.
Yes,
Hmm.
sir.
CA days.
Huh?
CA days, sir. स्कूल में तो कहाँ इतना पढ़ा रहे थे 11th 12th में.
So here, like 10% for 3 years. This is your present value. This is your present value factor, but we need to go with the annuity. Present value annuity table. Yeah, so here if you see 10% for a period of 3 years. So this is annuity 2.487, something like this, like I'm not sure, or maybe just this. So I'm just doing it simplicity for simplicity, plus 2000 multiplied by 12 month, first year, second year, third year. Let's assume this we are paying annual rather than monthly, just for the simplicity. So your present value factor for year 1 is 0.9009 and 0.826, 0.826 and 0.751. So this multiply by this is your present value of the total payments. So this is your paying. So this is more than $50,000, right? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Kashish, got it?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
So
sir.
this
मतलब
I
sir
was
9,664 profit. Oh, no.
Yeah, so this I was earlier saying 65,000, just like for a hypothetication. But now if you see this fourth point, you present value of the sum of the lease payment and any lease guaranteed residual value not already in the lease payment equal to or exceed the fair value of asset, then that arrangement is considered as a finance lease. If the future lease payment or the residual value multiplied by the present value factor is more than the current market price, then that lease is being considered as a finance lease.
सर मतलब 72,000 हमने 2,000 के हिसाब से करा था, राइट? तो सर अगर वो 78 या 80 के अराउंड होगा देन इट विल बी कंसीडर्ड फाइनेंस लीज, या अगर उससे कम भी होगा
No, this 59,000 is more than 50,000.
तो
50,000 is the car price, right? The present value of the total lease which you are receiving is 59,664. So 59,664 is more than 50,000, hence it is a finance lease.
और सर अगर इससे कम होता तो वो वैसे भी लॉस ही होता, तो और इसको हम
फाइनेंस में नहीं कंसिडर कर सकते थे?
No, for example, let's say it is 18,000 instead of 24,000. Let's assume this, and then there is a residual value. There might be a possibility that they have some residual value in that case. So so let's assume $10,000 is the residual value. That car can be sold at $10,000. So in that case of scenario, this way you will be calculating. So there would be
Sir,
some
वो
residual.
The point ऐसा है कि
point
प्रॉफिट
free
के
हो
लिए कोई
जाएगा
लीज, सर प्रॉफिट के लिए कोई लीज पे देगा ना,
हाँ, yes.
तो फिर तो ऑटोमेटिकली सारी लीज फाइनेंस में क्लासिफाई होंगी अगर इस लॉजिक से जाए तो.
नहीं. So there might be a possibility like it is for 6 months, it is for 1 year only.
सर लेकिन तब भी तो प्रॉफिट तो अर्न होगा ही ना उसमें उसके.
No. What I'm saying, for example, if the lease is only for 1 year,
करेक्ट.
so then it
जितना
is
कम टाइम होगा सर उतना फर्क पड़ जाएगा ना, उतना ही कम आएगा वो अमाउंट. तो
yes.
वो
बट फिर
मोस्ट
रेजिडुअल
प्रोबेबली
वैल्यू इंक्रीज्ड होगी.
No. In that case of scenario, you are just, for example, if you are giving just car on a lease for let's assume 1 year. So if you have purchased a new car for $50,000 and you have given it for a lease for 1 year, let's assume $1,500 a month. Right, so here the present value of the lease is 16,000, but if you see the depreciation in the year 1 is very high, right? So maybe like if you sell that car after 1 year of usage, it may sell at 25,000, right? So then this is not a finance lease.
सर होता भी है, जब कार निकलती है तो उसके बाद थोड़ा डेप्रिसिएशन उसका ज्यादा ही हो जाता है एक
First
साल में
year
ना,
is always high. Yes.
वेरी हाई. तो वो फर्स्ट 2 इयर्स में ही वो निपट जाता है. तो और लीज आपने कम टाइम के लिए दी है तो उस केस में प्रोबेबिलिटी है कि वो कम आएगा उससे अमाउंट, या हो
Then it
सकता
may
है
not
ऐसा.
jump into finance lease. It may be possible it will be an operating lease.
ओके. तो पॉइंट यही है कि अगर ज्यादा टाइम के लिए तो ही सेंस बनती है उस एंगल से, अगर कार के एस्पेक्ट से सोचे तो.
No, any other machinery also. Why would somebody give it? Like any machinery also, like generally, like initially, like whenever you buy anything new, in the first year depreciation is generally high.
Right.
Because market price go down, immediately you purchase.
Okay. Got it.
So next one is specialized asset with no alternative use. Like we were discussing earlier also, fire brigade truck, ambulance, molds, dies, right? So those kind of machineries are always be considered in the finance lease because the supplier have no alternative use. Right? If supplier has made mold specifically for the Goodyear tire, then MRF will not purchase it. Yeah, Bridgestone will not purchase it, right? So in that case of scenario, it is always be considered as a finance lease when there is a specific category of asset has been built for the respective customer. So when a lease will be considered as a finance lease from the leasee standpoint of view, first he or she will be getting the title, right, at the end of the lease term. Second, the lease contain purchase option, which is like material purchase option that leasee is reasonably certain to exercise. Third is lease term is for the major part of the remaining economic life. So if you are using a car for a 7-year on lease, that means you are using it for the major period of time. Third is present value of the future payments plus guaranteed residual value is equal to or more than the fair market value of that asset. The last one is specialized asset. If you have created specific asset for the specific consumer or customer, then that lease is being considered as a finance lease in the book of lessee, right? These are the 5 conditions very much same. From the lesser standpoint of view, to consider a lease is a sales type lease. So there's a difference in accounting for the sales type lease and direct finance lease. That is the reason separate category has been formed. So we'll be discussing that also. Any doubts so far?
No, sir.
No, sir.
If none of the above criteria are met, however, below two criteria are met, then lessor can classify that lease as a direct finance lease. So these are same criteria from lessor standpoint of view to classify any lease as a sales type lease. But if these criteria are not meeting, but below two criteria are meeting, then lessor can qualify that lease as a direct finance lease. First one is present value of the lease payment and any guaranteed residual value not already in the lease payment equal to or exceed the fair value. And second is it is probable that the lessor will collect the lease payment plus residual value. So basically this D point. If only this criteria is meeting and the collection is probable, then that lease can be considered as a direct finance lease from the lessor standpoint of view. We'll be discussing in detail about that. So as of now, just for your information, this point is here. But once we jump into the lessor accounting, we'll be discussing more in detail.
सर इसका तो फिर ये हो सकता है कि कुछ केसेस में लेसी की बुक्स में वो फाइनेंस है और लेसर की बुक्स में वो ऑपरेटिंग हो गया.
Yes, no. Lessee की book में it may be finance, but in the lessor's book, it can be a sales type lease or direct finance lease. That is possible. We'll be discussing like a lot of example we have, don't worry.
Okay, sir.
What is operating lease? Any lease agreement which does not qualify as a finance lease is considered as operating lease. So what we need to keep in mind is the finance lease, all the 5 criteria. If those criteria are meeting, then it is a finance lease. If none of those 5 criteria are not meeting any criteria, then it is an operating lease. So here again, like reiterating the same thing from the lessee standpoint of view, there are finance lease and operating lease. From the lessor standpoint of view, it can be sales type lease, direct finance lease, or operating lease. Okay, quick question. Which of the following statement about lessees is correct? For lessee, finance lease expense is present as one amount representing the straight line expense of lease payment and deferral of initial direct cost. Second is for lessees, finance lease, recognized interest expense would be the same for every year of the lease. Third is for lessee, operating lease expense recognized would be straight line amount of the future lease payment and deferred initial direct cost. For lessee, operating lease expense is broken into 2 parts for the presentation purpose, amortization of right to use assets and interest expense. So which of the following statement is correct?
Sir, fourth one.
What is that? For lessee, operating lease expense is broken into 2 parts, amortization of right to use asset and the interest expense.
नहीं सॉरी वो मैंने फाइनेंस पढ़ लिया था उसको, सॉरी ये नहीं होगा.
I know. It's early question. We have still not gone through that concept. But yeah, you can give a best try. Let's go one by one. For lessee who is receiving the asset, right? Finance lease is lease expense is presented as one amount representing the straight line expense of the lease payment and deferral of initial direct cost. So for the finance lease, so this lease expense is equal to the straight line expense of the lease payment and deferral initial direct cost. Is this statement right to say? Initial direct cost, like we discussed high level earlier, like for example, legal expense or lawyer fees or something you have paid for making an agreement.
इनिशियल डायरेक्ट कॉस्ट डेफर थोड़ी होती है, वो तो सबसे पहले वही रिकॉग्नाइज होती है ना?
No. Point is that you can capitalize that as a right to use asset and then defer it over the period of time, amortize it over the period of time. That's what it means.
तो जो समझ आया ना, जो सेकंड पॉइंट है वो तो नहीं है फॉर श्योर कि फॉर लीज फाइनेंस लीज रिकॉग्नाइज इंटरेस्ट एक्सपेंस वुड बी सेम नहीं होगा, वो इट वुड वेरी, मतलब वो हमें कैलकुलेट करना होता है डिफरेंस, तो वो हर साल वेरी करेगा, तो सेकंड स्टेटमेंट शुड नॉट बी करेक्ट. ओके, एंड फोर्थ स्टेटमेंट जो है दैट शुड आल्सो नॉट बी करेक्ट, जो राइट टू यूज एसेट वाली है, लीज एक्सपेंसेस ब्रोकन वाली. अब फर्स्ट और फोर्थ मेरे को फर्स्ट और थर्ड, फर्स्ट नहीं क्लियर हो रही कि बट एटलीस्ट उसमें मतलब अमोर्टाइज ही करेंगे हम या क्या करेंगे? आई एम नॉट क्लियर अबाउट दैट पार्ट, फर्स्ट पार्ट.
First or third may you are confused. Let's look at third. For lessee operating lease, the expense recognized would be straight line amount of the future lease payment and deferred initial direct cost. So generally, like operating lease, what is operating lease? Like month on month rent you are paying, right?
Correct.
So that expense you are recognizing, right?
But that would be a straight line.
स्ट्रेट लाइन मेथड में थोड़ी ना होगा
वो स्ट्रेट लाइन मतलब हाँ बताइए.
No. What's your thought?
मेरा ये थॉट था कि इसमें लिख रहे हैं एक्सपेंस रिकॉग्नाइज्ड वुड बी द स्ट्रेट लाइन अमाउंट ऑफ द फ्यूचर लीज पेमेंट्स एंड डेफर्ड इनिशियल डायरेक्ट कॉस्ट. बट ऑपरेटिंग लीज के केस में तो मंथ ऑन मंथ जो मेरी कॉस्ट बनती है मैं एज इट इज वो रिकॉर्ड करूंगा एंड दैट वुड बी सेम फॉर ईच मंथ. करेक्ट. तो उसको मैं स्ट्रेट लाइन अमाउंट नहीं बोल सकता, मतलब डेफरमेंट वो तो हो रही है, वो तो जैसे जैसे एक्सपेंस आ रहा है आई एम रिकॉग्नाइजिंग दैट ईच मंथ. एंड इनिशियल डायरेक्ट कॉस्ट को डेफर करेंगे या नहीं करेंगे आई डोंट नो दैट.
ऑपरेटिंग लीज में आई डोंट थिंक पर होता है, उसमें तो शायद साथ साथ रिकॉग्नाइज हो जाता है. और जो स्ट्रेट लाइन वाली चीज है वो या तो यही मतलब हुआ कि टोटल लीज वैल्यू कैलकुलेट कर ली और उसको डिवाइड बाय लीज टर्म से कर दिया, तो उससे स्ट्रेट लाइन हमने डिटरमिन कर लिया कि हर महीने इतना लीज अमाउंट रिकॉग्नाइज होगा.
Okay, let's park this question. I think like next concept we have on this. So first finish that concept and then we'll jump back onto this question. So let's try second question. Which of the following is a criteria for a lease to classify as a finance lease in the book of Lessee? The lease term is less than a major portion of estimated useful life of the leased property. So this is wrong. First option is right or wrong?
Wrong.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Wrong, right? Second option is the lease does not transfer ownership of the property to lessee. So this is also wrong.
Wrong है तो ट्रांसफर होता है तो कुछ.
Third is lease contain a purchase option that is reasonably certain to exercise. So this is right option, right?
Yes, sir.
Fourth one is the present value of the lease payment is 70% or more of the fair market value. So it should be equal to or exceed the fair market value, right? So this fourth option is also wrong. So this one is right.
Yes, sir.
Everyone
Yes,
on same page?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's understand the concept for this value, and then we'll come back to this question number 1 again. So now let's understand accounting treatment in the books of lessee. So lessee is receiver of the assets. So two things you need to do at the inception. First is recognizing the lease liability, And parallelly, you need to recognize the lease asset. So lease asset is called right to use asset. And these all to be calculated at a present value. What all things comes here? First is the payment made by lessee to the lessor before commencement of the lease. That means if you have given any down payment, plus any direct cost you are incurring on behalf of the lessor, plus the future lease payable in future, how much amount month on month or quarter on quarter you will be paying, plus any guaranteed residual value, minus any lease incentive if you are receiving. If you are taking that property on lease and you are getting any benefit from the lessor, then that benefit need to be reduced as a lease incentive. So that will give you the total base to calculate the present value of the lease liability. And then you'll be multiplying with the present value factor, same way how we did for the example in an Excel sheet, right? So that will give you the amount at which lease liability and lease assets need to be recognized. So what will be the accounting entry you are making in case of finance lease? First one is recording the lease assets and the liability at present value. So one side you'll be debiting the asset will be right to use asset. And what will be the credit is the lease liability. So with the amount which you have calculated above, right? So what will be the amount? Your down payment, your future lease payment, any direct cost you have incurred for the benefit of lessor, minus plus any guaranteed residual value, minus any incentive you are receiving, right? So total amount multiplied by the present value factor. So that will give you the amount which is considered for a right to use asset and the lease liability. So what you will be debiting? Asset, which is right to use asset. You'll be recognizing an asset, and at the same time you are recognizing the liability which you need to make the payment to the lessor in future. Make sense? Till first entry, it's all good? Or do
Yes,
you need it? Okay. So second entry would be when you are making the periodic payment. Let's assume you have taken a car on lease. Let's continue with this same example. Continue with this same example. Let's assume you are paying $18,000 at year end, right? Each year end, first, second, third year, and then residual value is $10,000. So total amount is going out of your pocket is 64,000, but the present value is 52,258. So with this 52,258, first entry you will be making right to use asset debit to the lease liability, 52,258. And now at the year end, you are making a payment of $18,000, right? So this $18,000 has two components involved in it. One is the principal, and one is interest, right? How much is the principal involved? This is the principal. And how much is the interest? This is the interest component. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Kashish, Prashant?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So this is equal to principal plus interest is your EMI, or you can say installment. Lease payment. So you are making a lease payment. So then you are reducing the lease liability, right? And you are reducing the cash. So with how much amount? You'll be reducing the lease liability 18,000 and you are
18,000.
paying cash 18,000, so you are reducing cash, but at the same time you need to record the interest income, interest expense. So you'll be making two entries. If I say first, I think it should go this recording of interest. First, I think you should record the interest of how much? 1638, right? So 1638 will increase. So what will be your closing value of the liability? So say this is your lease liability balance. So lease liability balance will be you have this much. Initially you have recognized lease liability plus you have interest, right? And then your minus lease payment 18,000. So this will be your remaining lease liability. Make sense? How much is the lease liability you have recognized?
Yes, sir.
52,258. You will be adding the
Plus
interest of the current year minus
yes,
the lease payment you are making. So this will be your remaining balance of the lease liability after these two entries. After these two entries. Right, Kashish? Prashant?
Yes, sir, got it.
Avneet? Everyone got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
At the same time, asset side, you need to do the amortization of assets, right? So assets always either depreciate or amortize, right? So lease assets are called amortize. So how much you'll be amortizing? So that will be your amortization expense to right to use asset, right? How much is your right to use asset? Right to use asset. You have this much value, right? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Amortization over the period of 3 years.
Yes, sir.
Okay, correct.
So this will
Yes, sir.
reduce. So your asset balance will be this much. Right? So this will be your right to use asset balance after 1 year. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
So this will be your amortization for right to use asset. Okay, one more quick question here. Which of the following citation, which of the following criteria, I think some typo error here. Which of the following criteria is used by lessee as a determinant for the classification of a lease, either a finance or operating lease? So which criteria the lessee should be using to identify any lease, whether it's a finance lease or operating lease, out of these four? First one is whether the lease has an effective interest rate at least equal to or equal to the incremental borrowing rate of the lessee. Second is whether the lessor's interest rate implicit in the lease agreement in determining in determinable form of the term of the lease. Third is whether the lease contain variable lease payment. Fourth is whether the present value of the lease payment constitute a significant portion of the fair value of the leased asset. So out of these four, which statement a lessee should consider to identify any asset is on finance lease or on the operating lease? Have you understood call of the question? What is the call of the question?
Sir, what are the determinants, whether to consider? finance or operating.
Out of these four, which factor you consider to identify that any asset to be a finance lease or operating lease?
Fair value.
Which option?
4.
Why?
So if fair value is greater than the like the lease value, then we are considering it as a finance lease. If it is less than that, then we are considering it as an operational lease.
How about others? Rahul, Akash, Ayush, Gurmeher.
सर है तो 4th ही सर, वो मतलब
हाँ वो तो
most
डार्क
probably.
तो फर्स्ट जो तो सर फर्स्ट ऑप्शन है उसमें थोड़ा डाउट है, मतलब वो
हाँ।
मतलब इनकेस अगर फोर्थ ऑप्शन नहीं होता तो फर्स्ट आंसर शुड बी फर्स्ट, राइट?
First answer is saying whether the lease has an effective interest rate at least equal to the incremental borrowing rate. So it's it's saying about discount rate, what you should consider basically. So is that the mandatory condition to consider
No,
any
sir,
lease
same
as a finance lease?
फर्स्ट वाली कंडीशन जो है सर, एंड जो सेकंड वाली भी है, इंटरेस्ट रेट इम्प्लिसिट है या नहीं लीज एग्रीमेंट के अंदर, वो जो 5 कंडीशंस थी, ये दोनों तो उसके अंदर नहीं फॉल करेंगी किसी भी तरह 5 कंडीशंस में मैंडेटरी,
और थर्ड भी नहीं फॉल करेगी क्योंकि वेरिएबल है या नहीं है वो उससे कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ रहा लीज टाइप में।
तो मतलब बस वही है कि है तो 4th ही आंसर, बट द थिंग इज कि क्या वो 4th जो है वो उसको मैं एक्सप्लेन कैसे करूं, वो नहीं मेरे को समझ आ रहा। वो
So whether the present value of the lease payment constitute a significant portion of the fair value of the lease asset. So same way like we have discussed here, what is the present value? 52,000. Is it like equal to or more than the market value?
हाँ, right.
Right, that's what it's mentioned. So if that is the case, we
Whether
can
significant portion of the fair value of the lease, मतलब वही, but इसमें greater और वो उसमें मैं confused हो गया।
that's a very valid point which you have picked up, Ayush. So here the thing is significant portion, right?
Correct.
So whether the present value of the lease payment constitute a significant portion of the fair value or not. So if it is covering the significant value, then do you think of considering that arrangement as a finance lease or not? So is this a triggering point or not?
Okay.
Right, so you need to choose the best right answer. There may be possibility that answer may not be absolutely right.
Right.
But
Correct.
does this give you a triggering point to consider or evaluate that lease arrangement to a finance lease arrangement? There might be some residual value, right? So significant portion of the future lease payment is covering almost the significant value, but remaining top up might be coming from the residual value. Like in this example also, if you remove this 10,000, it is covering 44,000, right? So 44,000 divided by 50,000, it's almost 89%.
89%, 90%.
So significant portion is coming from here, but then there would be some additional factor to evaluate, which is like residual.
Correct. तो उसी की वजह से we can determine now. ठीक है?
Yes.
Right.
So all the time answer may not be perfectly right, but you need to select the best right answer.
ठीक है, done.
Right?
Understood.
Everyone agree? Prashant, Rahul, Kashish.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, second is operating lease. Right? From the lessee standpoint of view, there are two categories of lease: finance lease and the operating lease. So operating lease, if it is not a finance lease, then it is a operating lease. Very simple. At the commencement of the lease, recognize the lease asset or the liability at the present value of the operating lease, right? Even if it is an operating lease, you need to calculate the present value of the total lease receivable, and if there is any guaranteed residual value. And you need to consider that for the right to use asset and the lease liability accounting, right? So first accounting entry is to record the assets or liabilities same way, but the amount will be different, right? So you'll be creating a right to use asset, which was not there earlier in ASC 840. So this is new in ASC 842, that you consider right to use asset and the lease liability even for the operating lease, right? This is also different from Indian accounting standard. So IFRS 16 and ASC 842 are very much aligned, but earlier ASC 840 was not having this provision, right? So now whether it's an operating lease or a finance lease, in both the scenario, you need to record the right to use asset and the lease liability in the books of lessee. But amount would be different, right? For the operating lease, let's assume it's just a 12-month lease. So the amount will be less. If you take the same example and let's assume it's only for 12-month lease, right? So the amount can be 16,362. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So right to use assets account debit to lease liability, and then record the lease payment periodically. So lease liability you will be reducing with the cash, and cash also you will be reducing when you are making the payment. Here you will be recording the expenses. So expense will be your lease expense minus right to use assets, which is, you can say, decrease the value of the right to use assets, or you can say amortization of the right to use assets, and reduction in the lease liability, that will be your interest expense. So that you need to recognize into the P&L. So your lease expense will be your amortization cost plus interest expense. Make sense? General rules. So there are certain general rules which you need to keep in mind. First one is major part of economic life. Generally consider more than 75% of the life of the asset. So if in the question it has been given to you that 8 year out of 10 year of the life of the machine is being used by the company, so then you can consider that company is using major part of the economic life. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Right?
जब
Second
जब
is
आप मेजर पार्ट की बात कर रहे थे, मैं सोच ही रहा था कि कोई रूल तो होता होगा उसको डिफाइन
हाँ,
करने के लिए.
so like these are, industry benchmark. These are not defined in accounting standard, but these are kind of
Okay.
industry benchmark which like most of the company consider.
Okay, okay.
Second is substantial amount of fair value of assets. When we say substantial amount, so it should be 90% or more than the fair value of asset. So here in our example, we were discussing like earlier this. So this was coming as approx 89%, right? I think so. Right? So 89 or 90% generally considered as a thumb rule. So this amount is a substantial amount. So to consider an amount to be a substantial amount of the fair value of asset, it is generally equal to or greater than 90% of the fair value of asset. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Third one is reassess the classification of a lease, whether it's a finance lease, sales type lease, operating lease, when there is a change in lease term or lease assets purchase option. If there is any change in lease term, like for example, earlier it was month-on-month lease, now you have entered into a updated agreement for 3-year period or 2-year period, right? Then earlier it may be an operating lease, but now it can be a finance lease, right? Same way, earlier you entered into a 3-year lease agreement where you are expecting it's a finance lease, but for any unforeseen reason, you have cut it down that lease to month-on-month lease. So then it may be possible that it can turn from finance lease to operating lease. So whenever there is a change in lease term or there is a change in lease assets purchase option, then you need to re-evaluate the classification of the lease, whether it's again continue to be a same category of lease or it is changing the classification of lease. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
So one quick question here. For operating lease, which of the following statement is incorrect? The operating lease does not meet any of the criteria for finance lease. The lessor record a lease receivable. An operating lease is considered as non-debt liability. Right and responsibility of owner are retained by the lessor. Which one of the following is incorrect statement?
सेकंड ही हो गई सर. अगर
No.
फर्स्ट थर्ड और फोर्थ तो मतलब बिल्कुल ही करेक्ट है. अगर
Uh,
हम एक एक करके.
so
An
first
operating
one
lease
is
does not any of the criteria for a finance lease. That is correct. That is true. लिखा हुआ है
yes.
उसमें. And
If
operating lease is considered as a non-debt liability, which is also correct. जो फोर्थ है उसमें लेसर के पास रिटेन होती है क्योंकि फाइनेंस लीज है जिसमें कि उल्टा होता है कि लेसी के पास वो एज एन एसेट रिकॉर्ड कर सकते हैं हम. So that statement is also correct. So I think
Yeah.
second should be the answer.
Yeah, Gurmehar, Rahul, Kashish, Prashant, Avneet, what's your thought?
Agree, sir, with Akash.
Rachita, Pulak, are you guys here?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So, what's your view? Do you echo with like what Ayush said? Or you have any doubt or any difference of opinion?
So starting में when we were considering which of the arrangements are lease and which are not considered as lease, which contracts are not considered as lease, we were discussing that rights and responsibility of ownership there as well. That if it is not getting transferred, it is not a lease.
No, if it is not getting transferred, then it will be operating one. If it is getting transferred, then we will convert it into finance.
Yeah, I think Rachita is mixing, like it is finance lease. We were discussing all those criteria for finance lease.
Okay.
Right. So I'll quickly reiterate. I know Ayush has perfectly explained. So quickly reiterate, an operating lease does not meet any of the criteria of finance lease. So that is a true statement. When any of the criteria of finance lease does not meet, then that lease is considered as operating lease. Third point is an operating lease is considered as non-debt liability. Yes, it is separate from debt, right? Third is right and responsibility of ownership are retained by the lessor because it's an operating lease, so rights are still remain with the lessor. So hence the second point is correct, which is lessor record a lease receivable. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so do you want 5 minutes or 10-minute break, or shall I jump to the lesser side?
Yes, sir.
I can feel it like it's getting drowsy. Okay, so let's take like it's 12:45. So let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 1 o'clock. Right?
Oh, okay. Sir.
Yeah, please come at 1 o'clock because we'll be finishing at 1:30 approx.
Okay, sir. Done.
Okay.